Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Besma Mamani on the era of disillusioning. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And I'm very happy every week to welcome a guest into the studios here at the Center for International Governance Innovation to talk about some timely important item on the global governance international agenda. And today I'm happy to welcome back yet again a resident expert here at the Balsley School and at CG, Besma Mamani, to talk about events in North Africa and the Middle East. And we've discussed this several times, and every single time so far you've been right. So I hope that this time you'll enable us to anticipate what's going to happen.
Doesn't work with lotto numbers, unfortunately.
Not with lotto numbers. But as you know, we began to use the phrase the Arab Spring to characterize this sudden series of popular revolts in the Middle East and North Africa that toppled some governments and didn't topple others. And that went out of fashion, and people began to promote the idea of calling it the Arab Awakening. Yeah. Debate about whether it was a democratic awakening or some other kind of awakening. Mm-hmm. And in recent news, it looks like it's not going particularly well. And so one possible interpretation is a pessimistic one, that it's a disillusioning. Either the people of the region are becoming disillusioned with their own efforts at internal change, or the outside world is disillusioned because we're not seeing in those parts of the world what we'd like to see there. So I'd like to talk to you about whether we should be pessimistic, optimistic, and sort of go a little bit case by case, maybe west to east.
Sounds good.
And get your read on what's actually happening in this complex, important part of the world. So we'll start with North Africa, and specifically Tunisia, Algeria. And Tunisia is where the so-called Arab Spring started, by surprise, when a street vendor basically killed himself out of protest to corruption, and it spread like wildfire.
Yeah.
A lot of people are pointing to Tunisia now and saying it's actually going very badly there, that they're headed back into a kind of a dark age. What's your understanding of what's happening and why in Tunisia, and why is the promise of the initial set of changes there looking like it's being squandered?
Well, I mean, I think overall I'm still optimistic, and I'm optimistic because I think that this is a structural transformation happening in the region. One can't go back, and although truly there is a lot of bumps on the road, and many of the countries are struggling, I think mostly economically, if anything. I think the root cause of any problems that are happening in the region is an economic malaise that's frankly global, but is obviously adding to the political pressure. But I think that ultimately this is a transition that the entire region has to go through. It's inevitable, and I do feel that in the long term, because of the demographics and the way that these countries have been developing, I think ultimately we'll see progress, but it's going to take time. Much of what we've looked at is just 2 years, and that's not enough, I think, historical record to really come with some sort of confidence that this is either positive or negative. So we really do have to be, I think, a little more tempered in our expectations. But ultimately, I think, going to Tunisia, which you started off with, Tunisia, it's easy to see that there has been some slippage, particularly on sort of the kinds of progressive values that Tunisia was at one point touting. And I think what we have to recognize is that often the regimes in many parts of the Middle East were able to continue this veneer of their being progressive, elite, liberal. You can use all the positive words, but I think that it often didn't reflect the aspirations of the people. People did not identify or frankly associate with the kinds of values and attitudes that many of the elite had at that time. So what we're seeing in Tunisia is, I think, democracy. And democracy shows that the country is not nearly as progressive and as liberal as its previous leaders had touted themselves to be. Now, we can say we wish that they would be more progressive and liberal, and I think there are many segments of Tunisian society, a minority, elite, privileged, who indeed wish that they didn't see the kinds of policies and views and attitudes that many of the people, that particularly the Nahda party, which has taken over, didn't espouse. But it's a reality. And I think that what one has to come to terms with is to say that these are societies that still have conservative values, and they may espouse ideas and values that we don't share, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that it makes them violent, doesn't make them enemies, it makes them different. And I think that there are particularly secular liberal elite in many of these countries, particularly Tunisia, perhaps Algeria today, which we'll talk about, Egypt, and Syria, that are not happy with what they see coming from their own ranks, from their own people, if you will. But that's democracy. Democracy is not about the elite secular winning. It's about the majority winning. And we have to come to terms with that. And I think that's something that is an evolving discussion. If anything, I think the best thing about the Arab Spring is we actually have a debate about the role of religion in society.
Right.
We never had that debate throughout the Middle East. I mean, there are the most, I think, interesting, talk shows, news analysis, coffee shop talk about what role should religion play. And it's a conversation, and it never existed before because it was assumed that it's not allowed to be a part of the society. And in fact, we knew it was. It just all went underground. And now it's bubbling to the surface. So I think there's something very healthy about that, even though, again, it's not what maybe Western analysts would expect or want, but at the same time, it is democracy, and we have to accept it that way.
And you see it basically the same story in Tunisia and Algeria and Libya. They're all more or less following the same trajectory.
Absolutely. I think Libya is having less of a problem with this. Libya is not nearly as, I think, conflicted, partly because the Libyan elite did not really try to tout itself as a secular liberal elite. It was a group of mafia, strongmen kinds of leaders. And now that the majority have taken over, I think we see a very different relationship between the masses and the new government. Much of what Libya is facing right now is fractured politics and a country that is deeply divided by different decentralized interests, because this rebellion was actually done basically decentralized, and now it's a matter of trying to consolidate power in Tripoli in the center, and there's real problems and challenges with doing that. But it's not nearly a debate or worry even on the issues of secularism and liberalism, which we see inherently being the main issue in Algeria, in Tunisia, and in Egypt, and to a lesser extent, but although there, in Syria today.
Well, good. Well, we'll talk about both Egypt and Syria in a moment when we come back with Besma Mamani. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Egypt. So Egypt actually has been dominating the news recently, and it looks as though there's serious danger at the moment of Egypt losing its governability, the new government actually being undermined in some way, possibly overthrown. The great fear inside the Beltway and in certain parts of Europe is that during these transformations in this part of the world, one of these important states, or maybe more than one, would be captured by radical jihadist Islamists. And all of a sudden, what used to be a small, relatively manageable terrorist problem becomes a big one because they have the whole resources of a state at their disposal. And I imagine that was the trope in the situation in Mali, which prompted the French and others basically to move before they actually did capture a state, although not a particularly well-functioning one or a particularly wealthy one. So, Egypt, what do you see happening there? What do you see down the road? Is this a situation that the current government of Egypt can manage, and can it manage it without in some way alienating half of the population, be it Islamic supporters or liberal secularists?
Yeah, Egypt is very interesting. They all are, but Egypt is very interesting because much of the crisis in Egypt today is because it has, albeit decaying, but it has institutions and a judicial process that everybody wants to follow. And that has, if you will, made things very difficult in the sense that we didn't have a clean slate and removing the old decaying institutions and starting anew. What we had here was a removal of one corrupt leader, brought in a democratically elected leader who now had to deal with the existing institutions, the existing procedures, the existing laws, and all of the, if you will, fiefdoms of different interests who want to control those particular institutions. So by that I mean the military, the judiciary, the business elite, and even industrialists that continue to capture the government from the old crony capitalists of Mubarak. And unfortunately, I think that what we see in Egypt today is a lack of patience. The government.
On the part of who, the government or the people?
I think the lack of the people. I mean, the people are really impatient, with good reason. Because, I think if I have visited Egypt 10 times in the past 10 years, and every time I have been, I have continued to see it fall on every measure of whether it's human development, whether it's sort of the nerves of people. I mean, you could only just measure that frustration by road rage, which just continued to go up. People had really high expectations that a new democratically elected government would come in and just clean up the mess. And unfortunately, he wasn't able to come in, President Morsi wasn't able to come in and just completely start anew. He had to deal with the existing system. And the existing system is bankrupt, it's corrupt, and frankly, just decaying in terms of its efficiency, productivity, and all the rest that you could put on that.
He did challenge it. He pushed various elements of it pretty hard. So hard that people thought that there was, at some points, risk that the military would step in, or the Tahrir Square would fill again with people demanding his ouster, and then the whole constitution looked like it was rammed down people's throat relatively quickly. I
mean, absolutely. And the Muslim Brotherhood has about 20 to 30% of the popular vote. And it's been able to, through no mechanism of their design, but a mechanism put in place by other powers, to basically allow them to get the majority of the government. And unfortunately, you add to that that the military had basically sacked the entire legislature, meant that Morsi had complete power. And on top of that, he had to deal with a very inefficient judiciary that wants to keep the semblance of these institutions going. It has pride in its own inefficient, frankly, decayed institutions, because that's the institutions that they built for all these years. And so Morsi has not had a chance to govern. He has not. And I think that we have to be fair. His style is not helping him. His style is completely reminiscent of Mubarak's. He takes the megaphone and yells. He takes to the stage and tells his people what they're doing wrong. And it's too reminiscent of the past. And the people of Egypt are just fed up. They want people to start doing things, to get things moving, get the traffic moving, get the garbage picked up. And none of that is happening. Now, there is a complete loss of faith, I think, at the moment in Morsi and the Islamist government being able to clean up. But I don't think it's necessarily fair on them for lack of trying. It really is, I think, they have spent so much time trying to consolidate power to work within the rules that they've actually shot themselves in the foot.
Well, what happens when expectations are so high and so unrealistic at the same time?
Frustration with no clear solution. I mean, you have people descending into Tahrir Square to commemorate the 2-year anniversary, and you tell them, great, you don't like what exists, but what's the alternative? And the alternative seems to be down with the regime. It's become a very easy slogan to say, as you know, and it worked, right? 18 days, you got rid of a 30-year, autocracy. How wonderful. But what next? I mean, what's the solution? There's no solution, unfortunately. I mean, you look at the National Salvation Front, which is supposed to be the cobbled together opposition movements of the Egyptian people, and they don't have a solution per se. They just don't like him. They don't like his style. They don't like his approach. They're willing to even go to the point of saying that he has no legitimacy, which I think is unwarranted, because he did win through a democratic process. Even though we don't like the results, it was a process that was free and fair. At the same time, they don't like him. They don't like his style, and they don't like the kinds of people that they've been, if you will, surrounded around the president, which are not the most enlightened, liberal, Western-leaning people. And so there's a real clash of high expectation, low delivery of government results, and unfortunately we're at this terrible impasse that I think few people know how to solve, short of just, throwing up one's hands and letting it go.
Do you think he'll suffer the same fate as Mubarak?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that we have 1 more month till a general election. In February, there will be a general election for the parliament. I think that, and I think that those who are on the National Salvation Front or in the opposition, this is their opportunity. Unfortunately, they continue to keep losing at the polls and say it's not fair. But they don't seem to have candidates that can put a vision together. And that's the essence of democracy, is to actually put forward your vision for the future, not just to complain. I mean, opposition serves 2 functions. Yes, it's to criticize existing government, fantastic. But you also need to come up with solutions on how you would do things differently. And unfortunately, they don't have those answers.
Well, we'll be curious to see what happens in those elections. We'll be back again in a minute with Besma Momani. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Syria, the dog that did not bark.
Yeah.
No spring yet. Maybe a spring at some point. So here's a regime that saw what was happening in the neighborhood and dug in and hunkered down and acted preemptively.
Yeah, absolutely.
It doesn't seem to be going well for him or for his opposition, and particularly doesn't seem to be going well for Syrian people who are being displaced massively.
Absolutely.
What can we expect here?
Unfortunately, I think that the State Department intelligence is right about Syria. It's descending into a failed state, and I think it's very problematic. I mean, back to your opening of sort of which country should we worry about being radicalized and taken by unsavory characters, it is Syria. And I think it is partly the international community's fault. I mean, it really is the regime's fault, first and foremost. But we waited too long, and we actually, through our basically putting our heads in the sand, not addressing what was happening in Syria very early on, has allowed the festering of these kinds of groups who have been basically descending onto it from all over the world to come and fight for what they think is some sort of jihad. And unfortunately, it's created a terrible situation that has really, I think, created a long-term crisis that we're going to deal with for a very long time.
Will it look like Lebanon did for so many years?
I think Lebanon would be a good thing. I have predicted it's going to be in Afghanistan, which is, I think, an even worse scenario than Lebanon.
Is there enough of an organized, very radical Islamist opposition to actually mount an effective control of at least a decent fraction of the country? If it's a failed state, that means by definition nobody controls the whole country. But
right. And we have fiefdoms and we have warlords at the moment. I mean, this is why, to me, it's very similar to Afghanistan, in that we have actually different so-called brigades with their own separate ideology, with no central command, each taking their own town and creating their own legal, political, economic structure independent. I mean, we have little fiefdoms, and it's getting worse by the day. And that has unfortunately, I think, continued because we've done nothing. And for all the sort of comments that, there's an enormous amount of weapons going into Syria, that's just not true. I mean, I think that there's a lot more intelligence to suggest that a lot of this is being smuggled in by the warlords themselves, by opportunists, and through taking over from defected soldiers. And unfortunately, the opposition on the ground, the rebels, have continued to get hardened. They've continued to, after 2 years of seeing what is an atrocious regime in terms of the kinds of inhumane practices, they have become hardened and more radicalized as time has gone on.
What do you expect the neighbors to do? Israel particularly, maybe Turkey, can they live with an Afghanistan on their borders?
Well, I mean, I think more importantly, the people of Syria, the 22 million people, cannot live inside in Afghanistan. That is not a hospitable environment for anybody to live in. So it's the people of Syria who are going to suffer the most from this.
Right.
I think that, I've advocated that I think the Western international community writ large needs to do something, and it needs to tip the balance in favor of the rebels at this point.
Which particular rebels?
Well, I think the Free Syrian Army, as much as we may not like them, and I don't think that they are no longer the champions of the cause anymore. In fact, ironically, as we saw in Afghanistan, when we had these warlords come in, often they were able to create loyal subjects in their little fiefdoms because they were able to put in some sort of law and order and structure. They were able to make something out of the chaos. They gave protection and security. And again, this is just the beginning of it. So either we do it now or we do it in 10 years when we have an Afghanistan on our hands. But I think Syria is where Afghanistan was circa 1998.
And will Israel sit by and watch potentially chemical weapons fall into the hands of Iranian sympathizers?
Well, I mean, I think that, the issue of chemical weapons has been made, I think, to be a big, obviously red line for so many countries, Israel included, but also some of the other countries in the neighborhood. But that's not a technology that is easily taken and mixed and delivered by low-level rebels. So there is a lot of worry about it, indeed. But the very fact that you had, for example, the Pentagon come out with a report that it would take 75,000 troops to basically recapture the so-called chemical weapons, I think points to the impossibility of it. It is not something that you can take over. You better off trying to sort of cut off the various arms of this octopus rather than try to do that when one will regrow back, is to think about getting to the head of this, which means get rid of the regime, get the transition process moving forward, and end the beginning of what I think is a radicalization of the rebels and the opposition.
Meanwhile, what do large refugee populations mean for a government like Jordan's?
Well, it's a huge financial burden, let alone a political challenge, right? Because often they are coming with significant baggage, and most importantly, it is a drain. Some of these countries are taking an influx of 10 to 20% of their population, Lebanon and Jordan in particular. That's a huge influx on both countries which are in economic messes. Jordan is under an IMF agreement. These are not countries that have spare cash to pay. So, and the international community, for all its efforts in saying that they will support and help on humanitarian side, has been unfortunately not very forthcoming.
Could it threaten the regime, say, of Jordan? The government of Lebanon?
One wouldn't know, but I think that this is not a region that you want to play around with. I think that we would rather see, I think, something like a real concerted effort to finish this, give a military solution to Syria than to have it continue to fester across the borders.
Very good. We'll be back one more time with Besma Momani. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So moving a little further east, technically out of the Arab world into the Persian world, Iran. So Iran has not experienced this internal transformation yet, though interestingly, there was a call among Iranian politicians for open and free elections, which are scheduled for May. Quick rebuff on the part of the clerics, who insisted that Iran has the freest elections in the world already. Sanctions are biting.
Yeah.
Currencies in the tank. It looks like the perfect storm brewing. What do you think we should expect in Iran? And is this actually the opportunity for the breakthrough on the part of the Green Revolution, the one that was almost but not successful last time around?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the Green Revolution, unfortunately, has pretty much disappeared. Much of that is unfortunately because as Iran has been under so much international pressure and being squeezed on so many ends, that in fact it's created a nationalistic current in the country that has made the Green movement less plausible and has made the Green movement more afraid to be openly oppositional to the government because they would be seen as supporting the terrible sanctions that everybody feels. I mean, ultimately, the sanctions, for all the legitimacy that one may think that they bring, also has unfortunately created the opposite reaction, where people now see that it's not Ahmadinejad and his cronies around him that are the source of the problem, but in fact the Western powers who want to deny the Iranian people everything from chickens, which is increasingly expensive in Tehran today. And that's unfortunately not the kind of scapegoating one wants to see. One wants to see the blame directed on the choices of the regime, but economic sanctions can backfire and the blame be put on the source of it, which unfortunately still is the West.
But if you were an opposition politician and you wanted to make headway in the elections, wouldn't you bend over backwards to make the argument that we're dying here and all true Iranians should understand that our way out of this mess is to clean sweep?
And I think that would resonate in a society outside of Iran. But I think the history there is such that any opposition leader who really wants to take issue with the government will need to stand on its own and not refer to opening to the West. This is not the time, even though it may be in their hearts. and they may truly feel it. And I think that the majority of the Iranian people are frustrated with not just the current government, but with this isolation from the West, and are very much in favor of actually having better ties with the West. In fact, if we look back at the time of Rafsanjani, we can see a lot of that Khatami, we can see a lot of that kind of pro-Western attitude. September 11th, for example, which brought out huge demonstrations in support of the American people. So there is a great, I think, sentiment within the society for better relationship. But unfortunately, the political area or arena is so contested and so polarized in this narrative of us versus them, that if you sort of choose them, you will unfortunately alienate many of the people that you want to have on your side. So best that the opposition not refer to this in terms of them being pro-Western or that they should open the doors to the West, but in fact to really make Ahmadinejad account for significant corruption that's happening, for example, that the Revolutionary Guard continues to sort of consolidate power away from other legitimate types or branches of government. And I think all of those will resonate without getting into the very touchy and sensitive subject of sanctions.
And what happens if there are food shortages, if basic staples just aren't available, if the currency becomes functionally worthless? All of which is totally plausible.
It's very plausible. And, there is some breathing room here because countries like Turkey and India have continued to trade with Iran using gold as opposed to currency, and they've been able to bypass some of these kinds of loopholes. Abu Dhabi or the United Arab Emirates has been a conduit for many of these goods coming through, although there's a lot of crackdown on that now. So the squeeze is on, but I think that this is a country that has survived sanctions for a very long time. I mean, this regime is in place since 1979, and the regimes continue to get tighter and tighter, and somehow Iran is able to survive. It's able to survive because it has a mixed economy, it has a strong industrial base, it has a flourishing agricultural sector. So it's not easy to squeeze. And economic sanctions, yes, it takes away some of those really important luxury goods and imported goods that many people want. Medicines is one that's continued to be an issue as well. But I don't think that it will crumble. And I think there needs to be a different approach, perhaps, to changing the mindset of the Iranian regime. And maybe the change of government, Ahmadinejad cannot stand for a third term, and so there will be a change in government. It will not be Ahmadinejad past May, and maybe that will be an opening. Obama's in a second term. Maybe there'll be a different way of trying to approach this, and I think that we might just see some receptivity among the Iranian people for that.
Meanwhile, the United States and Iran are already in open cyber warfare.
Absolutely.
Not officially, but it's not a secret anymore.
Nope.
We've never actually had a case where cyber warfare led to other kinds of warfare and large-scale loss of life. Is this a plausible scenario, or is the whole cyber warfare thing a sideshow, in your view?
Well, I mean, I think it suggests that what we all know, there's deep tensions and confrontation happening on various levels. But if one were to choose between outright conventional war versus cyber war, I think that we'd all prefer to see more cyber warfare and less conventional warfare, because ultimately one really kills people.
Mm-hmm. And there's a surprising quiet on the Israeli front now. And in your view, does that probably indicate that the Israelis are relaxing a bit more about the Iranian nuclear threat, or is it just a byproduct of the fact that the Israeli elections we just witnessed were clearly very much about domestic affairs and the economy and not so much about international politics?
Well, I mean, I think that actually I would say that the Israeli politics, I mean, this past election, indeed, a lot of domestic issues, but in fact, Iran was the only foreign issue. One example of that is a complete absence of any discussion of the Palestinian peace process. I mean, there was just nothing on the agenda from any of the political parties in Israel on that. So Iran is still a number one existential threat to them. Absolutely, the Israeli politicians, I think, will continue to bring that. We'll see in terms of what kind of coalition and the actions of the coalition that bring, I think, if Netanyahu is able to secure his right-wing coalition, we're going to see a lot more bantering towards the Iranians. I think if he's able to reach out to the center in that kind of coalition, there might be more of an introverted Israeli society and government that wants to focus on real issues, the economy, issues of secularism, which is a huge debate in Israel today, and also I think real important substantive issues on how to move forward in terms of the settlements and other problems that are continue to plague the peace process.
Mm-hmm. And you get the last word, which is which country should we pay attention to that we haven't spoken about today? Who's the potential surprise story in the region?
Wow. I think Jordan, Morocco.
Jordan. Not Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia is going to be a problematic state. It has 6,000 princes, all in the 85 average range. That's a lot of turnover.
A lot of turnover indeed. Well, thanks again for coming in. And
thank you.
That was a tour de force. As always, I learned a lot. So I appreciate you coming in so often and sharing your insight and wisdom with us, and to our audience. I appreciate your tuning in as well. So please do that again next week for the next episode of Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.